The eviction notice was salmon pink, chosen by some bureaucrat who believed color-coding human desperation made the process more efficient. Sarah Mitchell stood in her apartment doorway at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, the paper trembling against her thumb, 7 days to vacate printed in bold typeface that seemed to grow larger the longer she stared. Behind her, through the thin walls separating the kitchen from the living room, she could hear Jake moving around, trying to keep his younger siblings quiet, trying to be the man of the house at 14 because there wasn't anyone else to do it. The bank account on her phone showed $847. Rent was $1,200, 2 months overdue. The car had been repossessed yesterday from the grocery store parking lot while she was inside scanning items she couldn't afford to buy, her manager pretending not to notice when Sarah slipped an extra granola bar into her purse for Liam's lunch. They say rock bottom has a basement. Standing there with that pink paper and 3 jobs that together barely paid for cereal and the electric bill, Sarah understood she was about to find the elevator going down. Michael had been dead 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The construction company denied the insurance claim on a technicality buried in subsection 7 of the liability waiver he'd signed his first day on the job. Medical bills from his final hospitalization stacked up like accusation letters. $83,000 of proof that love couldn't stop an I-beam from falling or buy enough time to say goodbye properly. She worked mornings at Rosie's Diner, slinging eggs and coffee to people who complained about the temperature of their toast. Afternoons, she scanned groceries at Save Mart, feet aching and shoes held together with duct tape Jake had carefully applied in a pattern that almost looked intentional. Nights, after the kids fell asleep, she typed data entry for a medical billing company, squinting at a laptop screen until her vision blurred and the numbers started looking like hieroglyphics describing exactly how far a person could fall. Jake stood in the hallway now, backpack already on, his face carrying that expression he'd worn since the funeral, protective and angry and trying so hard not to let either show. His college fund had been emptied 6 months ago to keep the lights on. Emma had stopped asking about art classes. Liam's shoes were 2 sizes too small, but he never complained, just walked on the sides of his feet in a way that made Sarah's chest hurt. And Sophie, 6 years old with Michael's eyes and his habit of humming when she was nervous, still asked some mornings when Daddy was coming home, and Sarah had stopped trying to explain death to someone who believed in magic. The letter arrived at Rosie's during the lunch rush, delivered by a courier in a pressed uniform who seemed confused to be handing legal documents to someone wearing a gravy-stained apron. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, embossed with lettering that belonged in a different tax bracket. Brennan and Whitmore, attorneys at law, Asheville, North Carolina. Sarah opened it in the bathroom, hands shaking, because good news never came in envelopes that nice. William Brennan, deceased, sole beneficiary, Marigold Hill Hotel property. The words swam across the page, rearranging themselves into combinations that didn't make sense. Estate valued at approximately $200 million, including property and assets. Must claim in person within 30 days or reverts to state possession. She Googled the hotel on her phone, cracked screen making the images look even worse than they probably were. Abandoned since 1973. Structurally unsound. 3 stories of decay photographed from a distance, wrapped in vines and what looked like 50 years of silence. The Wikipedia entry was 3 paragraphs long, most of it speculation about why it closed, the rest local legend about hauntings that Sarah would have laughed at if her hands weren't shaking so badly. Rosie found her 20 minutes later, still sitting on the closed toilet lid, staring at words that promised either salvation or the cruelest scam ever designed to torture desperate people. The question came out flat, practical, because Rosie had survived 3 divorces and a bankruptcy and didn't waste energy on hope that couldn't be verified. Sarah held up the letter, watched Rosie's eyes track across the text, saw the exact moment the number registered because Rosie's face did something complicated. The words came out steadier than Sarah felt. An evaluation of probability conducted in a bathroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and decade-old regret. $200 for 1 day's drive, if real, salvation. If scam, $200 wasted but evicted anyway. So what difference did math make when you were already drowning? Rosie's pronouncement carried the weight of someone who'd learned that sitting still was just another way to die slowly. The Ford Taurus belonged to Rosie's nephew, Borrowed on a promise Sarah would return it with a full tank and an explanation if things went wrong. The kids packed in 15 minutes, everything they owned fitting into 4 duffel bags and 2 cardboard boxes that had previously held diapers. Emma brought her sketchbook, the expensive one Michael had bought her for her 9th birthday, pages filled with drawings of houses that didn't lean and families that stayed whole. Liam packed exclusively action figures and a rock he'd found that he swore looked like a dragon if you held it right. Sophie insisted on bringing her stuffed rabbit and the photo of Michael in his work clothes, smiling at the camera 3 days before the accident. Jake sat in the passenger seat, silent and suspicious, watching the road like it might try something. The GPS died 40 minutes into the mountains, signal consumed by trees that grew so thick they turned afternoon into dusk. The hand-drawn map from the lawyer's office showed roads that might have existed once, marked with instructions like turn at the rusted mailbox and veer right past the old sawmill. Navigation designed by someone who assumed landmarks lasted forever. Behind her, Emma drew steadily, pencil scratching against paper in a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Her voice carried the kind of hope Sarah couldn't afford to feel, the dangerous kind that made disappointment hurt worse. Jake's observation cut through the car's careful optimism, landing exactly where Sarah's thoughts had been circling for 200 miles. She didn't have an answer that didn't sound insane, so she focused on driving, following a map that assumed she'd know what a sawmill looked like after it stopped being a sawmill. Fairbrook appeared below them like a town that had forgotten it was supposed to die. The overlook showed fading rooftops, crooked chimneys, barely enough movement to prove electricity still ran through the wires. The population sign said 1,200, but someone had crossed it out and written 847 in spray paint, an adjustment made by someone who cared about accuracy even in decline. Main Street stretched for maybe 4 blocks. Storefronts shuttered with for lease signs that had faded into suggestions. Only a few buildings showed life. A diner with trucks parked outside, a hardware store with one flickering light, a post office that probably doubled as the social center for anyone still pretending the town had a future. The hotel rose above the tree line like something out of a Gothic novel written by someone who understood that beauty and decay weren't opposites. 3 stories of stone and timber, Victorian architecture that had probably been grand before the vines decided to reclaim it. The sign still hung above the entrance, cracked but legible. Gold letters that read Marigold Hill, Estain, 1921, in a font that suggested the place had once hosted people who knew which fork to use. Marigold flowers grew wild around the perimeter, the only living things that seemed to thrive here. Yellow blooms pushing through weeds and broken concrete like they were keeping vigil. 47 windows by Sarah's count, 12 of them broken, glass teeth glinting in the late afternoon sun. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle but held, wood weathered to gray but not yet surrendered. A turret jutted from the north corner, the kind of architectural flourish that made Emma gasp, already seeing castles and princesses in a structure that was probably full of rotten rats. Sophie's voice from the back seat carried the matter-of-fact tone she used when describing things no one else could see, and Sarah's stomach dropped because they didn't need ghost stories on top of everything else. The gentle correction came automatically, the same response Sarah had been giving for 6 months, ever since Sophie started talking about the people no one else noticed. Sophie's insistence was quiet but absolute, and through the rearview mirror, Sarah saw her daughter waving at an empty window, small hand moving back and forth like she was greeting an old friend. The front doors were chained, padlock rusted, but intact. A for sale sign leaned against the porch railing, Summit Ridge Development Corporation in crisp lettering, coming soon printed below like a threat. Sarah circled the building, testing windows, looking for entry that wouldn't require breaking and entering charges on top of eviction proceedings. The side entrance off the dining room had French doors with warped frames, wood swollen from decades of moisture and neglect. Jake helped her force them open, shoulder against wood until something gave with a groan that sounded almost alive. The smell hit first, mold and wet wood and something swiwied underneath, like perfume left in a closed room so long it turned into memory. Dust hung in the air thick enough to see, particles swirling through beams of light that cut through broken windows and cracked skylights. The lobby spread out before them, cavernous and dim. the kind of space that made you want to whisper. A grand staircase swept upward, mahogany railings carved with detail that must have taken months, each baluster different, handworked by someone who believed in permanence. The chandelier still hung from the ceiling, 6 feet of crystal that somehow survived 50 years of abandonment, catching light and throwing fractured rainbows across walls papered in patterns too faded to identify. The reception desk leaned to one side, marble top cracked but intact. Brass fixtures turned green with age. An old rotary phone sat behind the counter like it was waiting for a call. And there, beneath a layer of dust thick enough to write in, sat a leather-bound book embossed with gold letters. Marigold Hill Registry. Sarah opened it carefully, pages brittle under her fingers, and read entries written in fountain pen, handwriting from an era when penmanship mattered. June 3rd, 1956. Willis St. James. Seeking peace after loss of child. Departed, healed, heart lighter. September 14th, 1962. Thomas Keene. War won't release its grip. Departed. Finally resting, nightmares ceased. March 8th, 1968. Margaret Chen. Searching for purpose after divorce. Departed. Found calling. Left with hope. The pattern repeated page after page, people arriving broken, leaving whole, descriptions that read less like a hotel register and more like a miracle log. The entry stopped July 28th, 1973, the final name scribbled out so violently the pen had torn through the paper. The departure note said only, "Fire." Jake pulled blueprints from the desk drawer, original architectural drawings dated 1921, detailed enough to show not just the 47 guest rooms in 3 dining areas and the ballroom that took up half the second floor, but also a notation in the West Wing basement, private vault. The label sat there without explanation, because hotels didn't have vaults unless they were banks. And even then the placement was strange, deliberate, like whoever designed this place had been hiding something. The key rack behind the desk held mostly empty hooks, brass numbers corroded to the point of illegibility. But one key hung alone, polished enough to catch light. Room 7, the number etched in silver that hadn't tarnished. Sarah took it, felt the weight of it in her palm, and something in her chest pulled toward the staircase. The second-floor hallway curved along the east wing, wallpaper peeling in strips that looked like shed skin. Door number 7 sat at the end, silver numbers matching the key, and when Sarah turned the lock, the mechanism clicked smooth. Too smooth for a door that hadn't been opened in decades. The room stopped her breath. Dust covered every surface. Yes, but nothing was broken. The queen bed was made with linens yellowed by time but folded with hospital corners, tucked tight like someone still cared. The fireplace held wood that had been set but never lit, logs arranged with precision. A desk faced the window, positioned to catch the mountain view, surface clear except for a vase that held a marigold, wilted but recent, impossible in a building that had been empty for 50 years. The drawer wasn't locked. Inside lay an envelope, paper gone brittle, addressed in looping script. To Catherine Morgan, phone when you're ready. The date read 1990, 29 years kept waiting. Sarah opened it because she was already in too deep to worry about privacy, and the first line made her hands shake. If you're reading this, you came. I knew you would, or someone of your blood. The handwriting matched the registry entries, careful and deliberate, words chosen by someone who believed they mattered. The hotel isn't what they say. It was never cursed. It was sacred. I failed to protect it, to protect her. Maybe your generation can finish what mine couldn't. The letter continued, instructions mixed with apology. Look for the truth beneath the hearth. It's been buried too long. The gold is real, Catherine, but it's not the treasure. The truth is, Catherine Morgan was Sarah's grandmother, dead 12 years, and in all the time Sarah had known her, all the Sunday dinners and birthday cards and quiet conversations over tea, Catherine had never mentioned William Brennan, never mentioned Fairbrook, never mentioned a hotel or gold or truth that needed finding. The omission sat in Sarah's stomach like a stone. Sophie appeared in the doorway, rabbit clutched to her chest, and her pronouncement carried the simplicity of someone describing weather. The sleeping bags came out, spread across beds that might have been elegant once. They ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches from the cooler, the last of the food money spent on bread and Skippy. Emma declared it camping in a castle, determined to find magic in abandonment. Liam wanted to know about ghosts, his voice excited rather than scared. And Sophie, curled against Sarah's side, whispered that the flower lady wasn't scary, just sad, and Sarah didn't correct her because correcting meant acknowledging that her 6-year-old saw things, and Sarah didn't have the emotional bandwidth for that particular crisis. The town below showed maybe 20 lights, windows glowing in the dark like distant stars. The silence pressed against the glass, so complete it became its own sound, and Sarah stood there with questions that tasted like panic. Why me, why? What's beneath the hearth? Where's this gold? Who was Catherine Morgan really? And underneath it all, the question that terrified her most. What if this is real and I'm not brave enough to handle it? The footsteps from downstairs weren't the settling kind. They were deliberate, measured, the sound of boots on wood, and Sarah grabbed the fireplace poker, positioned the kids behind her, felt her heart trying to punch through her ribs. The knock came at 11:47, 3 sharp raps that said the person on the other side knew exactly where to find them. The voice was male, roughened by years but steady, carrying an apology in its tone that made Sarah open the door a crack instead of screaming. Marcus Cole stood in the hallway holding a thermos and a battery lantern, dressed in flannel and work boots, weathered face lined in ways that suggested experience rather than age. 50-something maybe, tall enough to have to duck slightly through door frames, with hands that had clearly built things and broken things and knew the difference. His eyes were kind, the sad kind that came from loss metabolized into gentleness, and something in Sarah's gut said trust him even though her brain was busy cataloging exit routes. His explanation came simple and direct. No wasted words. The economy of language used by someone who'd learned that talking too much just delayed the point. The name dropped like a puzzle piece clicking into place, because Sarah had seen it in the guest ledger. Because Laura Cole had been everywhere in the research, in the notes, in the conclusions drawn by someone who'd cared enough to dig. Army Ranger, 2 tours Iraq, 1 Afghanistan, and then 18 months watching cancer eat someone he loved. He'd sold the diner but ran it like a franchise, profits going towards something he wouldn't specify, living in a town that was dying because leaving felt like abandoning Laura's work. His wife's obsession made sense in retrospect, or maybe it didn't, but Marcus spoke about it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Research conducted while dying, dedication fueled by something beyond curiosity. The timeline clicked. William Brennan dead 1 month, Sarah's letter arriving 2 weeks ago, Marcus waiting to see if anyone would care enough to come. The out-of-state plates had been a beacon, proof that somewhere someone had received the inheritance and decided checking was worth the risk. Laura's research existed in 20 notebooks, Marcus explained, cross-referenced and annotated, the work of someone who'd approached local history like an archaeological dig. She'd found things, he said, documents the town wanted forgotten, connections that made people nervous. The cancer came 3 months after she'd interviewed her last source, aggressive and merciless. And Marcus had spent 5 years wondering if correlation implied causation or if grief was just making him paranoid. The offer came attached to a warning wrapped in concern, and Sarah found herself saying yes before her brain caught up, because alone in a haunted hotel with 4 kids and no backup plan was stupid, and Marcus Cole looked like the kind of person who showed up when he said he would. His final piece of advice landed heavy, words chosen carefully, and Sarah understood that whatever William had left wasn't just money, that secrets in small towns had teeth, that she'd stumbled into something with moving parts she couldn't see yet. Morning brought weak sunlight through broken windows and the smell of coffee from Cole's Diner 3 blocks down Main Street. The interior hadn't been updated since 1987 based on the decor, vinyl booths and Formica counters, and a jukebox that probably played the same 6 songs on repeat. Locals occupied the bar stools, old men nursing coffee like it was medicine, and every head turned when Sarah walked in with 4 kids in exhaustion worn like a second skin. Marcus served breakfast without being asked, eggs and bacon and biscuits that tasted like someone's grandmother had made them, and he put the plates down with a quiet on the house that meant arguing would be rude. The sheriff sat 2 stools down, 58 and weathered, badge pinned to a uniform that had seen better decades. Tom Hendricks introduced himself with a nod that acknowledged Sarah's existence without demanding explanation. His condolences came with the territory, automatic and sincere, followed by the kind of practical assessment that sheriffs probably learned in training. Inherited property usually meant inherited problems. Beth, the librarian, sat in a corner booth, 63 and sharp-eyed, someone who'd spent 50 years watching the town shrink and keeping records of its decline. Her aunt had worked at the hotel in the 60s, she offered, back when strange things happened, but the good kind, guests arriving broken and leaving fixed. Phenomena no one could explain, but everyone accepted. Frank from the hardware store was 71 and had the calloused hands of someone who'd built half the town, and his pronouncement carried the weight of someone who'd watched 2 generations wrestle with the same question. The Mercedes was black and new, the only luxury vehicle Sarah had seen since crossing into town, and it pulled up outside the diner with the kind of precision that suggested the driver knew exactly where he was going. David Brennan stepped out in a suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly income, shoes polished to mirrors, haircut expensive enough to make a statement. 45 and successful, corporate smile practiced to the point of reflex, eyes that assessed Sarah and found her exactly as poor and desperate as he'd expected. His introduction was smooth, hand extended for a shake that Sarah took because refusing would have been declaring war before she understood the battlefield. William was his great-uncle, he explained, family connection maintained through obligation rather than affection. Summit Ridge Development was his company, and plans for the area had been in progress for years. Development that would bring Moisean money and progress to a town that desperately needed all three. The check came out of his jacket pocket, already filled out, $500,000 written in the kind of handwriting taught at expensive schools. His pitch was reasonable, practical. The argument of someone who'd done this before and knew that desperation had a price point. The hotel was worthless as a structure, he explained, condemned by every inspector who'd looked at it, but the land underneath, 140 acres of prime mountain property, that had value. His offer was generous for a woman with 4 mouths to feed, and he was guessing not much else keeping her afloat. Sarah's response came out steadier than she felt. Buying time because saying yes meant giving up and saying no meant war, and she didn't know enough yet to choose. David's laugh had edges that cut, and he laid out the reality with the bluntness of someone who believed facts were better than kindness. The $200 million valuation included the land, he explained, assessed value on paper that meant nothing when the hotel itself was falling apart. But the acreage, positioned perfectly for the resort development Summit Ridge had planned, that justified the number if you squinted at the appraisal right. His offer was a gift to someone in her position, a lifeline thrown to someone drowning, and the implication that she should be grateful sat heavy in the air between them. Sarah stood because sitting felt like surrender, and her refusal was simple and absolute, a boundary drawn in language that didn't invite negotiation. The smile faded then, replacement mask dropping into place, and David Brennan revealed the businessman underneath the charm. 30 days to claim the estate, he reminded her, and after that the property went to state auction where Summit Ridge would be bidding. The timeline was set, the outcome inevitable, and walking away now meant walking away with something instead of nothing. Marcus's intervention came after David left, voiced low enough that only Sarah could hear, history delivered in the same tone he might use to warn someone about ice on the road. The notebook sat in a cardboard box in Marcus's truck, 20 spiral-bound journals filled with Laura's precise handwriting, cross-referenced with newspaper clippings and interview transcripts and photographs that someone had tried very hard to erase from public record. They spread them across the diner's back booth, and Sarah started reading while Marcus made fresh coffee and the kids drew pictures with crayons Beth had produced from somewhere. The first notebook was labeled The Healing Hotel, 1921-1970, and Laura's hypothesis was laid out in the opening pages. Marigold Hill wasn't just a hotel, it was a therapeutic sanctuary built on land that had been sacred long before Eleanor Morgan decided to monetize it. The Cherokee connection ran deep, documented in interviews with tribal elders and historical societies. Land that had been known as Unega Iqua, the White Path, a place where the sick came to heal and the broken came to mend. Natural springs had run through the property until they dried up in the 50s. water that supposedly held properties beyond chemistry. Eleanor Morgan had worked with a Cherokee healer named Running Deer, Laura documented, partnership that blurred lines between medicine and something older. The hotel operated on an unusual model. Guests stayed free, paid only what they felt their healing was worth, donations that somehow kept the place running for 50 years. Success stories numbered in the hundreds, documented recoveries from grief and addiction and trauma that defied conventional therapy. The second notebook carried a darker title, the 1973 fire investigation. The official report said electrical fire, 6 casualties, West Wing destroyed, case closed. But Laura had found witnesses whose accounts never made the report, descriptions of blue flames that didn't burn like normal fire, screams that didn't sound human, burn patterns inconsistent with any known accelerant. The fire marshal's private notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information request that took 18 months to process, said the fire started in the basement, origin point directly below what the blueprints labeled as the private vault. The critical detail sat in Laura's margin notes. William Brennan survived because he was in the West Wing basement when the fire started. He saw something, Laura wrote, underlining it 3 times. What did he see? The third notebook was titled Missing Persons, and Anna Raines dominated the pages. Checked in March 2, 1961, never checked out. Sheriff Thomas Brennan filed a missing persons report, then retracted it the same day with a note that said, subject relocated to California, case closed. But Anna's personal effects remained in room 12, unclaimed, and Laura had found them during a brief access to the hotel in 2019. A suitcase with clothes, a diary with entries ending March 1st, a silver ring with spiral carvings that matched Cherokee ceremonial jewelry. Laura's question was circled in red. Why would the sheriff retract? What did he find that made him stop looking? The final notebook Sarah opened was labeled Cherokee Sacred Ground, dated 2020, and the first page was an interview transcript with Dr. Elena Whitaker, Cherokee Nation historian at UNC Asheville. The land beneath Marigold Hill had been Unega Iqua for centuries, used by painkeepers who absorbed community suffering through ritual, physical anchors in the form of river stones carved with spiral symbols buried at 3 specific points. The practice required seasonal release, ceremonies that processed the absorbed pain and returned balance to the land. European settlers, Laura noted, learned the practice from remaining Cherokee after forced removal, but they corrupted it. Instead of release, they created permanent anchors, burial rather than processing. The Morgan family built the chapel first in 1842, then the hotel in 1921, each structure positioned over anchor points. The consequences, Dr. Whitaker explained in the interview, were predictable. Pain that couldn't be released would fester, land that couldn't process grief would rebel, and eventually the system would collapse catastrophically. Laura's final entry in this notebook was dated 3 weeks before her cancer diagnosis. William Brennan called today. First time we've spoken. He said, "Your research is important. Keep digging. But be careful. The land protects its secrets, sometimes fatally." I asked about Anna Raines, he cried, then hung up. Sarah closed the notebook and looked at Marcus, who was staring into his coffee like it held answers neither of them wanted to see. The storm came in fast, the mountain kind that went from clear sky to violence in 15 minutes. Thunder shook the hotel's frame, rain hammering windows hard enough to crack the ones already weakened, and lightning turned night into a strobe show that made Sophie cry and Liam cheer. Sarah was checking the kids, making sure the sleeping bags were positioned away from the leaking ceiling, when the sound came from below, not thunder, but something structural. A crack followed by a boom that said something had given way. The lobby floor had split, a fracture running from the hearth toward the reception desk, and the hearthstone itself had sunk 8 inches, tilted at an angle that exposed dirt underneath. "Look for the truth beneath the hearth," William's letter had said, and Sarah understood that the storm hadn't broken the floor. It had opened it, revealed what was supposed to stay hidden. The crowbar came from Marcus's toolbox, left behind after his midnight visit, and Sarah wedged it under the hearthstone, pride with leverage that made her shoulders scream. The stone shifted, and she went to her knees, digging with her hands because tools felt wrong for this, dirt pushing under her fingernails, mud from rain that had seeped through cracks, making everything slick. 2 feet down, her fingers hit fabric, floral print from an era that photographed in Technicolor, the kind of dress that went with pearls and gloves and optimism about the future. 3 feet down, she found the hand, skeletal fingers wearing a silver ring carved with spirals that matched Laura's description exactly. The full body emerged slowly, positioned ceremonially, arms crossed over the chest, flowers placed around the head that had long since decomposed to dust. This wasn't violence, Sarah understood. This was burial, respectful and deliberate. Someone laid to rest with honor, even if that rest was secret. The locket hung around the neck bones, tarnished but intact, and Sarah opened it with shaking fingers. 2 photos inside, both girls, one maybe 12 years old with a crooked smile and eyes that looked familiar. The other, younger, darker, beautiful in the way that suggested Cherokee blood ran strong. On the back of the locket, engraved in script so small Sarah had to squint. Anna and Catherine, 1955. Emma's voice from the stairs should have startled Sarah, but shock had burned through to some kind of numb acceptance where nothing surprised her anymore. Her daughter stood 3 steps up, sketchbook clutched to her chest, and the confession came out matter-of-fact, the tone kids used when describing something adults insisted couldn't be real. Sarah took the sketchbook, flipped to the page Emma indicated, and the drawing stopped her heart. The lobby, rendered in 11-year-old precision, perspective slightly wrong but details right. The chandelier, the desk, the hearth. And on the floor, exactly where Sarah was kneeling now, Emma had drawn an X in red crayon, labeled in careful letters. Look here. The question came out broken because Sarah had packed their apartment 3 days ago, and Emma had drawn this weeks earlier, before they knew about the inheritance, before they had ever heard of Fairbrook. Emma's explanation was simple and impossible, and Sarah's mind tried to find rational explanations while her gut accepted that some things didn't have rational explanations, that her daughter saw things, that Anna Raines had been reaching across decades and miles to make sure someone found her. Marcus arrived 15 minutes after Sarah called, saw the body, and his training kicked in, photographer's memory cataloging details before emotion could cloud observation. He found the name carved on the inside of what had once been a wooden burial shroud, letters cut deep. Anna Raines, 1943-1961, beloved. Sheriff Hendricks came next, old-school cop who'd seen enough in 40 years that a buried body didn't shock him, but the implications made his jaw tight. He identified her from the description, memory pulling up the missing persons case his predecessor had filed and retracted, the case that officially said Anna Raines ran off to California to start over. His assessment was quiet and certain, decades of reading crime scenes informing his conclusion, and the cold case opened officially at 2:37 in the morning with a phone call to the State Police Forensics Unit. Sarah found herself standing on the porch at 3 a.m., unable to be inside with the body, with the truth, with the weight of what finding Anna meant. The sheriff had declared the lobby a crime scene, yellow tape, and evidence markers and photographs that would become part of a file that should have been opened 63 years ago. The kids were upstairs with Marcus, who'd volunteered to keep watch, and Sarah stood in the rain getting soaked because clean water felt like absolution she didn't deserve. The Mercedes pulled up despite the hour, headlights cutting through rain, and David Brennan got out already talking, demanding to know why the sheriff was at his family's property, why Sarah had called law enforcement without consulting him, why everything about this situation was spiraling into chaos he couldn't control. Then he saw the body bag being loaded into the medical examiner's van, and his face did something complicated. The request came out hoarse, performance replaced by something that might have been genuine, and Sarah found herself in Suite 7 with David Brennan, while Marcus stood guard outside the door, giving them privacy but ready to intervene if needed. David's confession started with his grandfather, Sheriff Thomas Brennan, and the admission that family oral history had always known Anna Raines hadn't run off to California. The recording on David's phone was old. Cassette tape transferred to digital, and Thomas Brennan's elderly voice came through the speaker, confessing to sedation and burial and 24 years of waiting for divine judgment that came 3 days after the recording in the form of a massive heart attack. The pattern David laid out was stark. Every man in his family who knew about Anna died young, grandfather at 62, father at 58, uncle at 54, And David was 45 with a daughter 8 years old who he desperately wanted to see graduate high school, get married, have kids of her own. The curse wasn't supernatural, he insisted. It was genetic. Stress and guilt metabolized into heart conditions and strokes and cancers that statistics said shouldn't cluster like this. He'd thought buying the hotel and demolishing it would end the pattern, erase the evidence, let his family finally breathe. The photo he showed Sarah was weaponized emotion. Melissa Brennan, 8 years old, soccer uniform, gap-toothed smile, and the desperation in David's voice when he talked about not wanting to die before she grew up was real enough to hurt. Sarah's response came from the part of her that had spent 2 years learning that death wasn't a curse. It was a consequence that Anna Raines didn't want revenge. She wanted what every buried person wanted, to be seen, acknowledged, mourned properly instead of erased. The offer went up to $750,000, cash within 24 hours, and David's argument was purely practical. Sign over the property, leave town, let him handle this quietly. Spare everyone the public destruction of reputations and family names, and the childhood innocence of a little girl who didn't deserve to learn her great-great-grandfather was a murderer. Sarah's refusal was equally practical, math conducted in real time, and the words came out harder than she'd intended because she'd spent 2 years being told what she couldn't afford and she would unaccepting other people's calculations of her worth. David's threat landed sharp, information deployed with the precision of someone who'd been saving it for exactly this moment. The gold William hid, David explained. His grandfather had helped hide it. Legal ownership might belong to the Brennan family rather than the Morgan line, and Sarah wouldn't see a cent without a legal battle that would drain the estate dry through lawyer fees and court costs. 27 days remained on the 30-day claim window, and David's exit line was delivered with the timing of someone who'd practiced it. You have 27 days left. Tick-tock. The hotel settled into the kind of quiet that came after crisis, exhaustion replacing adrenaline, and Sarah gathered her kids and Marcus in the lobby that was no longer a crime scene but would never feel clean again. The sheriff had finished his preliminary investigation, forensics team scheduled for morning, and his gentle but firm instruction was clear. Everyone needed to leave for the night, give the investigators space to work, come back tomorrow when the professionals had documented everything. Marcus's offer of his place was kind, but Sarah refused, needing neutral ground, needing space to think. They'd stay at Cole's Diner, she decided, in the apartment Marcus kept above it for storage. Tomorrow they'd figure out how to get into the West Wing vault, how to prove the gold existed, how to fight David Brennan with resources she didn't have. Jake's question was practical, the kind of problem-solving he'd learned too young, and Sarah held up the blueprint Emma had found, the architectural drawing that showed exactly where the vault entrance should be if 50 years he hadn't destroyed it completely. The determination in her voice surprised her, words spoken to the ruined lobby and the empty space where Anna had been buried, and the mountain that had kept this secret so long it had forgotten how to let go. Tomorrow they would dig, tonight they would rest, and somewhere in the space between those two truths, Sarah would figure out if she was brave enough to finish what 3 generations of cowards had started. Sophie stood at the window waving, and Sarah's question came automatic, the parent script running even through exhaustion. The answer was delivered with 6-year-old certainty, and Sarah watched her daughter wave at empty air, describing conversations with dead women and messages about gold hidden where fire had started, and she exchanged a look with Marcus that said either they were both losing their minds or something in this hotel was paying attention. Marcus's interpretation was steady, practical, the kind of statement that should have sounded insane but somehow didn't, and Sarah nodded because West Wing basement was specific enough to be tested and vague enough to get them killed if the structure collapsed. They left the hotel at 4 a.m., drove 3 blocks to the diner, carried sleeping kids up narrow stairs to an apartment that smelled like coffee and old wood. Emma's final words before sleep took her were quiet but absolute, a pronouncement delivered with the confidence of someone who'd seen things no one believed but knew were true anyway. And Sarah sat in the dark, listening to her children breathe and wondering what the hell she'd inherited, besides money and ghosts, and a truth that had been buried so deep it had started growing roots. The certified letter arrived at Cole's Diner while Sarah was pouring coffee for the morning regulars, hand-delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about ruining someone's day before 9 a.m. The envelope was legal-sized, crisp, stamped with Summit Ridge Development Corporation letterhead in gold foil that caught the fluorescent lights. 30-day foreclosure notice. The cover sheet announced in bold type, hotel mortgage $280,000 in default, payment due in full by day 30, or property transfers to corporation ownership. Sarah's panic tasted like copper. The inheritance paperwork was still in probate, the lawyer in Asheville had explained. Estate assets frozen until the court verified Williams' will and cleared any potential challenges. 90 days minimum, possibly longer if complications arose. She had 30 days until foreclosure, 90 until she could access funds to pay it, and the math didn't work no matter how many times she recalculated. Marcus read over her shoulder, his silence heavy with implications, and when he finally spoke, his assessment carried the weight of someone who'd watched corporations devour small towns for 20 years. The phone call came within the hour. David Brennan's voice smoothed through the speaker, offering $350,000 cash for immediate purchase. Spare you the burden of that old ruin delivered with practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes even through audio. His eagerness registered as wrong, too fast, too convenient, and Sarah's instinct said this wasn't business. This was personal. The question came out sharper than she'd intended, exhaustion making her blunt, and David's pause lasted 3 seconds too long before he answered. Sentimental reasons meant family secrets, meant David knew more than he'd admitted in his courthouse breakdown, and the warning in Marcus's expression said, "Don't sign anything. Something's wrong. We're missing pieces." The town meeting that afternoon drew 200 residents to the community center, more people than Sarah had seen in Fairbrook combined since arriving. The room divided cleanly, older folks who remembered the hotel's glory days, younger families who saw only an eyesore, and developers who saw dollar signs. Frank from the hardware store stood at the microphone first. 71 years of memory compressed into 3 minutes of testimony about Anna Raines, about kindness everyone had failed to protect, about the town's complicity in silence that had lasted 6 decades. Beth, the librarian, followed, presenting evidence that Fairbrook had been dying since 1973, population declining in direct correlation with the hotel's closure, businesses shuttering year by year like dominoes arranged by fate. Maybe, she suggested, the town had been dying because they'd buried their conscience along with Anna, cosmic punishment delivered through economic collapse and demographic decline. The vote when it came was 127 to 43 in favor of supporting Sarah's inheritance claim, and the announcement felt like permission she hadn't known she needed. Validation from people who'd lived with this ghost longer than she'd been alive. The notebooks Marcus had held back sat in a cardboard box marked Laura Personal, and he'd kept them separate because they contained conclusions so dark he had wanted to protect Sarah from them until protection became impossible. They spread them across the diner's back office, and Sarah started reading while thunder rumbled outside, storm clouds gathering for another assault on the mountain. Laura's handwriting in these pages was shakier, written during the worst of the chemotherapy, but her mind had stayed sharp even as her body failed. The hypothesis laid out in Notebook 18 connected dots that formed a picture Sarah wished she could unsee. Cherokee Sacred Ground operated on a principle called pain tethering, physical anchors that absorb communal suffering so individuals could heal. The practice required balance, seasonal ceremonies that processed the absorbed trauma and released it back to the earth in a form that could nourish rather than poison. The Morgan family, Laura documented, had learned fragments of this practice from remaining Cherokee after the Trail of Tears, but they'd corrupted the understanding. Instead of temporary absorption and release, they'd created permanent anchors, stones that held pain indefinitely. The chapel built in 1842 sat over the first anchor. The hotel constructed in 1921 covered the second and third. Eleanor Morgan hadn't built a business, she'd built a trap, a spiritual landfill where other people's trauma could be buried and forgotten. The system worked, Laura noted, as long as the pain was voluntary, guests who chose to leave their suffering and walked away lighter. But when Eleanor allowed Anna to be murdered and buried, when she chose silence over justice, the contamination began. Murder wasn't grief, it was violation, and the anchor stones couldn't process it. The pain fermented, turned toxic, and the 1973 fire was the first crack. the system trying to purge itself through flames. Laura's interview with Dr. Elena Whitaker took up 40 pages. Technical discussion of Cherokee spiritual practices rendered in academic language that couldn't quite contain the horror. The anchor stones were cracking, Dr. Whitaker explained on tape, fractures that would eventually cause complete failure. When that happened, all the absorbed pain would release at once, catastrophically, taking the building and possibly everyone in it. The timeline Dr. Whitaker provided was chilling. Based on the rate of deterioration Marcus had photographed in 2019, the stones had maybe 2 to 3 years before critical failure. That was 5 years ago. They were living on borrowed time in a building that was essentially a spiritual grenade with a corroded pin. Marcus's revelation came quiet, guilt making his voice rough, and Sarah wanted to be angry but couldn't find the energy, understanding that he'd been trying to protect her the same way Catherine and William had tried to protect their secrets. And protection was just another word for cowardice. The address for Reverend Thomas Hayes came from Beth, who'd called ahead to the Briar Hollow nursing home and gotten reluctant permission for a visit. The drive took 40 minutes through mountain roads that twisted like intestines, and Sarah brought only Jake, leaving the younger three with Marcus because this conversation felt like something a 14-year-old needed to witness, needed to understand that family history was made of choices that echoed through generations. Briar Hollow was more estate than facility, old money warehoused in Victorian architecture, and Reverend Hayes occupied a room on the 3rd floor that smelled like antiseptic trying to cover decay. 92 years old, wheelchair-bound, but his eyes tracked Sarah's entrance with clarity that said his body had quit, but his mind remained stubbornly functional. Hayes's voice was tissue paper thin, words chosen carefully like each one cost something he couldn't afford to waste. Sarah sat across from him, close enough to see the liver spots on his hands and the tremor in his fingers when she mentioned Catherine Morgan's name. The prophecy felt wrong, too convenient, but Sarah pulled out Catherine's confession letter and the locket, placed them on the table between them, and watched recognition dawn on the old man's face like sunrise he'd been dreading. The story Hayes told was uglier than Sarah had imagined, family shame measured in layers of concealment. Anna, born 1943 to Genevieve Rains, Cherokee woman who'd worked as Eleanor Morgan's housekeeper. Father unknown, but whispered to be a Morgan relative, which made the whole thing incestuous, scandal compressed into one illegitimate child. Catherine, born 1942, same mother, different father, skin light enough to pass for white in an era when passing meant survival. Eleanor adopted Catherine legally when the mother died in childbirth with Anna, but Anna was too dark, too obviously marked by heritage that Eleanor's society friends would never accept. So Anna became the hidden sister, raised in the same house but different worlds. Catherine in the main residence, learning piano and etiquette, Anna in the servants' quarters learning invisibility and resentment. The accusation hit like contamination, belief system that had enabled murder through categorization. And Hayes didn't deny it, just nodded slowly like he'd been waiting 60 years for someone to call it what it was. Anna had been different, Hayes continued, sensitive in ways that made adults uncomfortable, talking about voices in the trees and pain that lived in the walls, walking the forest at night barefoot, communing with something the town couldn't name. Guests started reporting her in their rooms at night, not threatening them, but warning them, pointing at walls or floors like she could see through to what was buried underneath. The town called her cursed, blamed her for nightmares and sleepless nights, and the pressure on Eleanor to remove her daughter mounted until it became easier to make her disappear. The night before the fire, Hayes said, they dragged Anna from the crawl space where Grace had hidden her for 3 years, living beneath the floorboards like an animal, surviving on scraps and Catherine's guilt-driven supply runs. The sheriff wouldn't file a report, said if she vanished, the mountain might sleep again, and Eleanor agreed because her reputation mattered more than her daughter's life. Catherine had fought, Hayes remembered, 19 years old and powerless against her adoptive mother and the sheriff with a badge and a syringe. She'd held Anna while the sedative took effect, whispered apologies that couldn't undo compliance. And when Anna stopped breathing, Catherine's scream brought William running from the basement where he'd been checking on foundation issues. The burial happened at dawn, Hayes confessed, himself present as the town's spiritual authority, saying words over a body that should have been autopsied, blessing a grave that should have been investigated. They laid her beneath the hearth because that's where she'd drawn stars in the dirt when she was a child, Before Eleanor understood what Anna was, poetic justice that was really just poetry covering murder. Catherine had left Fairbrook the next week, changed her legal name to Catherine Morgan exclusively, dropped reins like it burned, married a man from Tennessee, and never spoke of her sister again. But Hayes had gotten letters, twice a year for 49 years, Catherine's handwriting describing dreams where Anna called her name, guilt that had metabolized into depression so severe it required medication and therapy, and the kind of silence that killed slowly. Sarah's question came out broken, voiced cracking, because her grandmother had raised her, had taught her to bake cookies and identify birds and survive disappointment, and none of that fit with someone who'd let her sister die without justice. Hayes's answer was delivered with the gentleness of someone who'd spent 90 years learning that people were more complicated than their worst moments, and Sarah wanted to reject it but couldn't, understanding that Catherine had been a teenager in an impossible situation, that compliance under threat wasn't the same as consent, that guilt and responsibility weren't always distributed fairly. The final piece Hayes offered came with a warning attached, information delivered like a live grenade passed hand to hand. The hotel's purpose had been corrupted when Eleanor started charging money, Hayes said, but before that it had worked exactly as intended. Anna had been a natural painkeeper, born with the ability to absorb suffering, and she'd been doing it unconsciously since childhood, taking on the trauma of everyone around her until it made her strange, made her see things, made her unable to function in normal society. When they killed her, they'd murdered the one person maintaining the system, and the anchor stones had started failing immediately. The 1973 fire was the stones trying to burn away contamination they couldn't process. Every subsequent death, every piece of bad luck in the Brennan family, every person who had stayed at the hotel and died young, all of it traced back to the moment they'd buried Anna without witnessing her properly. Hayes pulled a photo from his wheelchair's side pocket, image yellowed but clear. Anna Raines at 16, standing in the hotel garden, surrounded by marigold flowers, smiling at a camera held by someone who loved her. On the bow, William's handwriting, my Anna, my heart, my greatest failure. Sarah took the photo, felt the weight of it settle in her palm like evidence at a trial, and Hayes's final words came out hoarse with age and regret. The expedition to the chapel ruins began at dawn. Sarah and Marcus and Jake, equipped with shovels and metal detectors, and the kind of determination that came from knowing time was running out. The storm had passed but left the ground soft, mud sucking at their boots as they climbed the half-mile trail through forest that had reclaimed the path decades ago. The chapel foundation sat in a clearing that felt deliberately isolated. Stone walls collapsed into piles that might have been graves or might have been architecture surrendering to entropy. The altar remained partially intact, cross-shaped stone jutting from earth like an accusation. Marcus started digging at the altar's base, reasoning that important things got buried at symbolic locations, and 3 feet down his shovel hit metal with a clang that echoed through the trees. The iron box was 2 feet long, rust-welded shut, and they had to use a rock to batter the hinges loose, violence that felt appropriate given what they expected to find. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly survived 6 decades underground, sat a leather-bound book with no title, pages filled with handwriting that predated William's. Older script, formalized, each entry structured like a medical record. The Ledger of the Lost, Sarah thought, and started reading aloud while Marcus photographed pages and Jake took notes in his phone because evidence needed redundancy when challenging powerful people. The entries spanned 1845 to 1973, 47 names total, each marked with date, circumstances, and outcome. Daniel Wexler, April 1953. Checked into room 9 complaining of recurring drowning nightmares. 3 weeks later found an empty bathtub, lungs full of water, despite no water present. Death ruled accidental drowning in impossible circumstances. Martha Keene, July 1958. Reported hearing deceased husband's voice through walls. Found in basement frozen solid despite July heat. Autopsy showed ice crystals in blood that shouldn't form in living bodies. The pattern emerged after 15 entries. People didn't just die at Marigold Hill. They died in ways that manifested their trauma, grief becoming literal, psychological wounds turning physical. The hotel wasn't killing them, Sarah realized. It was processing their pain incorrectly, stones overwhelmed by suffering they couldn't metabolize, and the excess was leaking out in forms that violated natural law. Anna's entry was longer than the others, marked with different ink like someone had come back later to annotate. Anna Marie Raines, March 2nd, 1961. Beloved daughter of the land, carrier of others' wounds, murdered for loving wrongly, buried in honor beneath the hearth because Catherine begged and William wouldn't refuse her anything. This death breaks the covenant. The stones will fail. God forgive us for what we've done. The final entry was written in William's handwriting, dated August 3rd, 1973, the day after the fire. The lost deserve witness. I have failed them. 47 souls crying for acknowledgement, and I gave them only silence. May someone braver than I tell their stories. May someone finish what I was too weak to begin. Jake's question came out steady, mature beyond 14, and Sarah found herself grateful he'd insisted on coming, grateful he was seeing this, understanding that bearing witness to history made you part of fixing it. Marcus's interpretation was delivered with military precision, tactical assessment applied to metaphysical concepts, and it made terrible sense. Explained why the hotel felt alive, why Sophie saw things, why the building itself seemed to react to their presence, the call to Dr. Whitaker was scheduled for 3 p.m., video conference from the library's single computer, and the Cherokee historian's face on the screen showed both fascination and horror at what Sarah described. The burial ledger was unprecedented, Dr. Whitaker explained, documentation of a corrupted pain-keeping system that should never have existed in the first place. And her academic excitement couldn't quite mask her disgust at what Eleanor Morgan had done. The anchor stones were the key, she explained with an urgency that suggested this was time-sensitive information. 3 river stones carved with the spirals buried at the chapel, the hotel lobby, and the West Wing basement. They needed to be found, documented, and removed, but the process required ceremony, required acknowledgement, required truth spoken publicly before physical intervention, or the stones would shatter and take the building with them. The timeline Dr. Whitaker provided was specific and terrifying. Based on the structural damage Marcus had photographed, the rate of crack propagation, and the escalating supernatural phenomena Sarah described, the stones had maybe 2 weeks before catastrophic failure. After that, the building would collapse, the land would remain poisoned for generations, and the 47 souls would be trapped indefinitely in whatever spiritual architecture Eleanor had constructed. Sarah's objection came out practical, numbers that didn't work, and Dr. Whitaker's response was blunt enough to hurt. The gold was Cherokee property, Dr. Whitaker continued. Payment Eleanor's ancestors had made for permission to use sacred ground, and keeping it was theft compounded over a century. Returning it was the bare minimum required for the land to begin healing. And arguing about inheritance law, while 47 people screamed for release, was the kind of moral calculus that had created this mess in the first place. Jake's interjections surprised both women, wisdom delivered with teenage certainty, and Sarah looked at her son and saw Michael in his expression. Practical ethics that didn't require complicated justification. The blueprints Jake found in the hotel library that afternoon changed everything. Tucked behind a filing cabinet that had been shoved against the wall to hide water damage, architectural drawings from 1920 showed not just the hotel's layout but the underlying tunnel system, passages connecting all 3 anchor points, infrastructure that predated the building itself. The tunnels were Cherokee, Marcus realized, original ceremonial pathways that Eleanor had incorporated into her design, co-opting sacred geometry for profit. The main entrance to the tunnel system sat beneath the dining room, the one Sarah had found during the storm, but 2 other access points existed. One in the collapsed chapel foundation, one in the West Wing behind room 16's closet. The network was extensive, 5 interconnected chambers, and the blueprints marked them with Cherokee syllabary that neither Sarah nor Marcus could read. Dr. Whitaker translated via photos sent to her phone, and her voice when she called back carried reverence mixed with anger. The chambers were marked: grief, fear, rage, shame, and in the center, balance. The anchor stones sat in the first 3 chambers, absorbing their designated emotions. And the balance chamber was where pain keepers would perform release ceremonies, processing what the stones had collected. But there was no indication Eleanor had ever used the balance chamber. No evidence of ceremonies performed, just absorption without release for 80 years. And Dr. Whitaker's assessment was delivered like a medical diagnosis for terminal illness. David Brennan's escalation began with legal filings, injunctions, and motions delivered by process servers who seemed genuinely apologetic about serving papers to a woman clearly in over her head. Emergency hearings scheduled for day 13, challenging Sarah's claim on grounds that William's will was written while mentally incompetent, that the estate's value had been inflated to commit fraud, that Sarah had deliberately damaged property by allowing the West Wing to remain unsealed, despite knowing it was structurally unsound. The hearing would determine everything, Marcus explained after reading the documents. And David had hired 3 lawyers from Asheville, whose hourly rate exceeded Sarah's monthly income from all 3 jobs combined. The message was clear. David could afford to fight indefinitely, and Sarah would run out of money and energy long before legal resolution. The psychological warfare began day 8. Phone calls to Sarah's cell from blocked numbers. Hang-ups at 3 a.m. that woke the kids. Messages left at the diner saying things like, "Careful investigating old buildings. Accidents happen so easily, and small towns have long memories. Make sure your children know where the exits are." The sheriff couldn't trace the calls, said harassment required proof of direct threat, and David's public presence remained perfectly cordial, waving at Sarah on Main Street like they were neighbors rather than opponents in a war over inheritance and truth. The building inspector, who condemned the West Wing, arrived day 9 without warning, official capacity that allowed him to override Sarah's property rights, and his assessment was delivered with the finality of someone reading a death certificate. Structurally unsound, liable to collapse within 72 hours, illegal to enter, violations subject to criminal charges. The condemnation notice went up on all West Wing entrances. Yellow tape that said this space was off limits to everyone, including the owner. Sarah understood the trap immediately. The gold was in the West Wing vault. David had arranged the condemnation, and if the building collapsed before she could excavate, the evidence would be buried in rubble David could claim through salvage rights. The timeline had just accelerated from weeks to days, and every move she made would be documented, recorded, used against her in court. The decision to enter the West Wing illegally came at 11 p.m. day 8. Sarah and Marcus and Jake, equipment borrowed and stolen, plan that violated at least 4 laws and possibly qualified as breaking and entering on her own property. The sheriff didn't know plausible deniability that would protect him when this went wrong, and the alternative was letting David win through legal manipulation that used safety regulations as weapons. Room 16 was worse than photographs suggested, floors sagging beneath their weight, ceilings showing daylight through cracks that hadn't existed a week ago, air thick with char that had survived 50 years through sheer stubbornness. The closet's false back panel resisted, screws rusted into wood grain, and they had to pry it loose with crowbars that made sounds like bones breaking. The ladder descending into darkness was steel, industrial, anchored into stone with bolts that suggested this wasn't original architecture, but later modification. And Marcus went first because he was trained for confined spaces and knew how to assess structural integrity while descending into unknown depths. The vault chamber exceeded expectations, 30 feet across with a domed ceiling carved from living rock, walls showing tool marks that predated metal implements, and in the center, mounted on a stone pedestal, carved with spirals, sat 42 wooden crates stacked in careful rows. Marcus photographed everything, documentation that would matter in court, and Sarah pried open the first crate with shaking hands. Gold coins spilled across stone, double eagles dated 1920 to 1932, the kind of currency that hadn't been legal since Roosevelt confiscated private gold holdings, and the shimmer in the battery lantern light was enough to make Sarah's breath catch. 500 coins per crate, Marcus estimated, after quick count. 42 crates meant 21,000 coins, face value $420,000, but collector value possibly $5 million if the dates were right and the condition good. The anchor stone on the pedestal was cracked, fracture running through its center like a wound, and faint blue light pulsed from the break with a rhythm that suggested heartbeat. The stone was failing visibly, structural integrity compromised beyond repair, and Marcus's assessment was delivered with the certainty of someone who'd seen buildings collapse and knew the warning signs. The leather journal they found in a niche carved beside the pedestal was Williams, dated 1921, and the first entry explained everything. Eleanor Morgan and William Brennan had negotiated with Chief Running Deer payment for permission to build on sacred ground, gold as collateral for a contract that required witnessing, required release, required honoring the land's purpose. The crates had to remain in the vault beneath the anchor stone, William wrote. Removal would break the covenant, risk catastrophic consequences. Sarah's dilemma crystallized into numbers that measured morality in dollars. $2 million in gold could solve every problem, fund every dream, secure her kids' futures through college and beyond. But William's warning was explicit, and the blue light pulsing from the cracked stone suggested moving the gold would accelerate failure rather than prevent it. Sophie's voice from the ladder made everyone jump, small form descending, rungs she should have been too short to reach safely, and her presence in a space they'd specifically forbidden terrified Sarah more than the supernatural phenomena. The warning came out calm, matter-of-fact, and Sophie explained that Anna had shown her pictures in her head, visions of fire and collapse, and the mountains swallowing the hotel whole, consequences of greed masquerading as salvation. The decision to photograph but not remove came from Jake. Surprisingly, 14-year-old pragmatism that understood documentation was power, and physical possession was liability. And they spent 2 hours cataloging every crate, every coin visible through slats, every angle that would prove to court and to David Brennan that the gold existed and Sarah had legal claim. The structural collapse began as they loaded the 29th crate, warning groan that became roar, ceiling debris falling in chunks that could kill, and the anchor stone split completely, blue light erupting into flames that didn't burn but blinded, and Anna appeared solid enough to cast shadows in the impossible fire. Her command carried weight beyond volume, authority that made Sarah's hands freeze on the crate she'd been lifting, and Anna's manifestation was complete now, visible to all three of them, face matching the photographs but animated, alive in some way that defied biology. Marcus's argument was practical, desperation making him loud, but Anna's response was immovable, absolute, and something in her tone said this wasn't request but requirement, that the gold remaining wasn't about money but about balance, about contracts honored even when they cost everything. The decision point lasted maybe 5 seconds, measured in ceiling cracks spreading and Marcus pulling Jake toward the ladder, and Sarah making eye contact with a dead woman who was telling her that some inheritances couldn't be claimed without destroying what they represented. Sarah's single word was both surrender and faith, and they climbed, leaving 13 crates worth approximately $900,000 to be buried under West Wing rubble, and the vault ceiling collapsed as Jake cleared the ladder's top rung, dust cloud rising through the hole like a soul escaping. And outside the West Wing caved inward with a sound like the earth taking back what was always hers. David Brennan arrived while fire trucks were still spraying water on debris, saw the destruction in the 29 crates on the lawn covered with tarps, and his face cycled through emotions too fast to track. Rage landed first, accusations about Sarah destroying property worth millions. But Sheriff Hendricks had been present, had seen the collapse, had documented that Sarah was securing assets during force majeure event, and the legal ground David was standing on turned to quicksand under scrutiny. The confrontation happened in full view of the town, street filling with onlookers who'd heard the collapse and come running, and David's voice carried across Main Street when he accused Sarah of theft and recklessness and deliberate sabotage designed to deny him what his family deserved. Sarah's response was quiet, exhaustion making her words hit harder, and she gestured to the pile of rubble that had been the West Wing, to the crates of gold that represented not wealth but the consequences of choices made a century ago, and asked David what exactly his family deserved after what his grandfather had done. The silence that followed was complete, every person present, understanding they were witnessing the moment when polite fiction surrendered to documented fact. And David's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispered urgent advice about not saying anything that could be used in proceedings, but David was past listening. His breakdown was public and total, voice cracking as he described family curse and dead relatives and an 8-year-old daughter who'd asked if great-great-grandpa was a murderer. And David had lied because admitting truth meant admitting the Brennan name was built on murder and silence and every generation's complicity. Sarah's empathy was real but insufficient for forgiveness. Understanding that David was a father terrified for his child, but also a man who'd used that fear to justify burying truth deeper, and the cycle had to break somewhere or it would just continue. Melissa Brennan growing up to make the same choices David made, protecting reputation over justice until the weight crushed someone else. Marcus stepped between them before escalation became violence, physical presence that said this conversation was over, and the sheriff's gentle but firm directive moved David back to his Mercedes, lawyer already on phone making calls that would probably involve more lawsuits and definitely involve more money than Sarah could counter. The hotel settled into exhausted peace. West Wing gone, but the rest still standing, and Sarah sat on the front steps with her kids and Marcus and Sheriff Hendricks, watching stars emerge through mountain air that smelled like char and rain, and something Sarah couldn't name but felt like endings. The question hung between them, practical concerns that couldn't wait for rest, and Sarah pulled out Catherine's confession letter, smoothed it against her knee, and made a decision that was either brave or stupid, and probably both. The plan formed in her exhausted mind with clarity that suggested she'd been building toward this since finding Anna's body. Write everything down, every name in the burial ledger, every detail of the murder, every piece of evidence Laura had collected and Reverend Hayes had confirmed, and make it public before David could bury it again through legal maneuvering and corporate pressure. Marcus's practical question demanded practical answer, and Sarah looked at the ruins of the West Wing, at the gold that was physically present but morally complicated, at her children who just watched her choose truth over fortune, and understood that this was the moment where Catherine's granddaughter either became someone who finished what 3 generations couldn't or became another link in the chain of cowardice. The testimony took 6 hours to write, 2,500 words that documented murder and conspiracy and 63 years of institutional failure. And Sarah attached every photo, every ledger page, every piece of Catherine's confession that proved the Mitchell family wasn't innocent, but was trying to become honest. She sent it to the Asheville Citizen-Times, to Cherokee Nation official channels, got Dr. Whitaker for academic submission, to Beth for posting on the Facebook page that had already gained 4,000 followers, to everyone who might care that justice had been denied and was finally, painfully, being served. The document went live at 3 p.m. day 10, and within 2 hours, Sarah's phone showed 15,000 shares, comments flooding in from people who'd lost relatives to unexplained deaths in small towns, from Cherokee activists who'd been documenting sacred site desecration, from women who recognized Anna's story as their own story told with different names. The media arrived by 6 p.m., 3 news vans that turned Fairbrook's Main Street into a staging ground, and Sarah did one interview with local station on-camera statement that was simple and absolute. Anna Raines deserved her name spoken aloud, Sarah said into the camera, and the rest of us deserve to reckon with what silence cost. David Brennan's response came through his lawyer, official statement that called Sarah's testimony slanderous allegations against a deceased sheriff with no due process. But the recording of Thomas Brennan's deathbed confession was already circulating online, and public opinion was forming faster than legal teams could counter. The probate hearing got moved up to day 13 judge's decision that said the media attention required swift resolution, and David's leverage was evaporating in real time as descendants of the 47 buried ledger names started contacting Sarah with thank you messages that felt like absolution she hadn't earned but desperately needed. Sophie's final vision came that night, whispered into Sarah's ear while the younger girl was supposed to be sleeping, message delivered with 6-year-old certainty that suggested Anna had said goodbye. The planting happened at dawn, Sarah with a trowel digging into the lobby floor where Anna had been buried, placing the marigold Sophie insisted was real, even though no marigolds grew in November, and the flower took root in ways that violated botany but honored something older. The trial didn't matter, Sophie had said, because Anna was already free, and standing there in the empty lobby with dirt under her fingernails and exhaustion in her bones, Sarah believed her daughter in ways that required faith she didn't know she still possessed. Marcus found her an hour later, both of them understanding that tomorrow's hearing would determine everything and also nothing, that the work of witnessing was already done, and whatever came next was just paperwork catching up to truth that had finally, painfully been dragged into light. The Asheville County Courthouse smelled like floor polish and institutional anxiety. marble floors reflecting overhead lights in ways that made everything look like it was underwater. Judge Margaret Whitfield entered at 9 a.m. exactly, 68 years old with silver hair pulled into a bun that suggested she tolerated no nonsense from lawyers or litigants or the universe itself. The courtroom had filled beyond capacity, standing room only, media representatives lining the back wall with cameras and recorders, and Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with Maria Singingbird, the Cherokee Nation legal aid attorney who'd taken her case pro bono and looked ready to fight. David Brennan occupied the defense table with three lawyers whose suits probably cost more than Sarah's car had when she'd owned a car, and his face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from knowing you were on the wrong side of history but committed to fighting anyway. The gallery held Farrowbrook residents, Cherokee Nation observers, descendants of the 47 buried names, and reporters who'd driven from as far as Charlotte for a story that had legs beyond regional interest. The opening arguments established battle lines with surgical precision. David's lead attorney was Raymond Fletcher, 62, and experienced in probate challenges, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to winning through endurance rather than brilliance. William Brennan's will was invalid, Fletcher argued, written during final stages of dementia when competency was compromised, evidenced by doctors' diagnosis from 2023 showing cognitive decline. Sarah Mitchell was an opportunistic stranger exploiting a dying man's confusion, capitalizing on distant family connection to claim assets that rightfully belonged to closer living relatives. The dementia diagnosis hit like expected ammunition, medical records submitted as Exhibit A, neurologist notes documenting memory lapses and confusion that technically qualified as early-stage cognitive impairment. David had clearly been preparing this challenge for months, collecting evidence while pretending concern about curses and family safety, and Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her chair. Maria Singingbird stood with the controlled fury of someone who'd spent a career watching legal systems fail Indigenous people and had stopped being surprised but never stopped being angry. Her counter was surgical, presenting the updated will from 2024, 6 months after the dementia diagnosis, notarized by two attorneys who'd conducted independent mental competency evaluation specifically to prevent this exact challenge. The evaluation included cognitive testing, memory assessments, and explicit verification that William Brennan understood his assets, his heirs, and his intentions when making Sarah Mitchell sole beneficiary. The will stood, Maria concluded, because William Brennan's lucidity on the day of signing was documented by medical professionals with no vested interest in the outcome, and David's challenge was what it had always been, an attempt to bury family crimes through legal technicality. Fletcher pivoted to property damage, presenting inspectors' reports and photographs documenting West Wing collapse, structural failure that Sarah had allegedly caused through negligent entry into condemned space. $3 million in property value destroyed, he argued, recklessness that demonstrated unfitness for managing the estate, even if inheritance claim was valid. Maria's counter came faster. Sheriff's testimony already entered into evidence, showing Sarah had been preserving assets during emergency structural failure, that the gold recovered proved she'd acted to protect rather than destroy, that condemning someone for trying to save what could be saved during force majeure event was exactly the kind of legal manipulation that turned justice into theater. The gold itself became contested territory, Fletcher arguing that Cherokee payment to Eleanor Morgan in 1921 created trust that might legally belong to Morgan business partner descendants, that Brennan family had co-managed the hotel and therefore held claim to assets stored on property, that Sarah's removal of 29 crates without court permission during asset freeze constituted theft regardless of intention. Judge Whitfield called recess at 10:30, announced she needed to review Catherine's confession letter and supporting documents in chambers, and the break stretched into an hour while lawyers paced and Sarah tried not to vomit from nerves that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with understanding that her entire future hinged on one woman's interpretation of inherited guilt. The elderly woman entered during recess, walker clicking against marble with rhythm that suggested determination overcoming physical limitation, and her announcement to the bailiff carried the force of someone who'd made peace with consequences and was ready to speak regardless of cost. Betty Walters had been presumed dead, Sarah's brain catching up slowly because Laura's research notes had said deceased 2019. But the 92-year-old woman lowering herself into the witness chair was very much alive and angry enough to make dying wait until after testimony. Judge Whitfield's surprise was visible but controlled, judicial training taking over, and her ruling that this testimony was relevant to William's mental state, which David had raised as central issue, shut down Fletcher's objection before it could gain traction. The oath was administered, Betty's hand shaking on the Bible, and Maria Singingbird conducted direct examination with the gentleness reserved for elderly witnesses who might not survive aggressive cross. Betty's voice was stronger than her body, words delivered with the clarity of someone who'd rehearsed this confession for 63 years. The clinic in 1961, Anna Raines, 8 weeks pregnant, Sheriff Thomas Brennan arriving with sedative and instructions that Betty refused because this wasn't medical care. This was something darker. The threat came swift and certain, termination from the only job in town, and Betty's resistance crumbled under economic pressure that felt worse than violence because it was legal. The injection Thomas administered himself, Betty continued, something Betty hadn't recognized, dosage that was clearly wrong, and Anna dining within 20 minutes while Betty watched and Thomas called Eleanor Morgan instead of an ambulance. The payment came later, $500 in cash that Betty kept in a coffee can for 60 years because spending it felt like profiting from murder, and the weight of that money had become heavier than any physical burden her body carried. The courtroom had gone completely silent, breathing suspended, and Betty reached into her cardigan pocket with hands that trembled from age and intention, producing a small spiral notebook with pages yellowed but legible. The clinic log from 1961 was original documentation, Betty explained, kept hidden because Sheriff Thomas had made clear what happened to people who talked, and the entry was stark in its bureaucratic precision. March 1st, 1961, 11:47 a.m., Anna Raines, 8 weeks gestation, Thomas Brennan administered injection against medical advice, patient unresponsive, 11:52 a.m., patient deceased, 12:04 p.m., death certificate falsified as natural causes at sheriff's instruction. Fletcher's cross-examination was aggressive, demanding proof that the log was authentic, that Betty's memory after 60 years was reliable, that any of this was more than elderly confusion seeking attention. But Betty's response was delivered with dignity that made aggression look cheap. The notebook passed to Judge Whitfield for examination, and the pause while she read felt like waiting for verdict on a verdict. Layers of judgment stacking until the original question about inheritance seemed almost irrelevant compared to the weight of documented murder. David Brennan stood abruptly, face drained of color, and his outburst bypassed his lawyer's attempts to silence him with hands on his shoulders and frantic whispers about not speaking. His confession tumbled out in fragments, admitting knowledge his lawyers clearly hadn't sanctioned sharing, and Fletcher was on his feet objecting to his own client's testimony while David kept talking about grandfather's deathbed recording and family curse that was really just consequences, and 8-year-old Melissa who'd ask questions David couldn't answer without lying. Judge Whitfield's command cut through the chaos, voice that probably made experienced attorneys feel like misbehaving children, and David sat slowly, chest heaving, while his legal team exchanged looks that said their case had just imploded. The recess lasted 30 minutes, Judge Whitfield reviewing documents in chambers, while the courtroom buzzed with speculation that sounded like bees swarming around honey they couldn't quite reach. Sarah sat motionless, Maria beside her radiating controlled satisfaction, and when the judge returned, her expression was settled into something that looked like resolution achieved through painful calculation. The findings were delivered methodically, numbered points that transformed subjective interpretation into objective conclusion. William Brennan's will was valid, mental competency evaluation thorough and properly executed. Sarah Mitchell was rightful heir through Catherine Morgan, Eleanor's adopted daughter, chain of inheritance legally sound despite informal adoption practices common in 1944. The gold ownership presented complexity, but Cherokee Nation Council's brief arguing for return based on sacred covenant, combined with Sarah's documented willingness to split recovered assets, demonstrated good faith that satisfied both legal and ethical requirements. The ruling came measured and final. 29 recovered crates would be divided equally, 50% to Cherokee Nation representing original covenant payment, 50% to Sarah Mitchell as William's heir, operating under demonstrated respect for land and tradition. The remaining gold buried in West Wing rubble belonged to Cherokee Nation for excavation at their expense and timeline, proper return of payment that had been held in trust beyond its intended purpose. The property determination was equally clear. Marigold Hill Hotel, 140 acres and remaining structures, belonged to Sarah Mitchell, free of encumbrance. Assessed value of $4.2 million, accounting for land quality and historical significance despite structural damage. David Brennan's probate challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile, couldn't appeal this specific claim, couldn't use courts to continue fighting battles his family had already lost through actions taken 6 decades prior. The gavel strike felt like punctuation on a sentence that had been running on too long, and Sarah felt Marcus's hand on her shoulder. Steady pressure that said, "You did it, we did it." Anna's story is now part of official record instead of buried secret. David's reaction was immediate and destructive, standing so fast his chair toppled backward, voice carrying across the courtroom with accusations of travesty and family persecution, and Sarah's exploitation of tragedy for personal gain. Judge Whitfield's warning was sharp, instructing David to sit and be silent or face contempt charges, but he was beyond listening. His rant about Brennan family building the town, deserving recognition rather than condemnation, entitled to property his grandfather had helped manage, hit the walls and died there, sound without substance, and the judge's patience expired with finality that suggested she'd presided over too many wealthy men having tantrums to tolerate another. The command landed with weight that silenced the courtroom, and David collapsed into his chair while Fletcher and the other attorneys began damage control that looked futile. Client who just destroyed his own case through inability to accept that justice sometimes required acknowledging your ancestors were monsters. The final ruling addressed David's accusation directly, Judge Whitfield's voice carrying acid that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. The court acknowledged Thomas Brennan's documented crimes, Eleanor Morgan's complicity, and 60 years of institutional failure that allowed murder to be buried as missing person case, and the only travesty was that justice had taken this long to arrive. The courtroom cleared slowly, reporters chasing quotes, Cherokee Nation observers speaking in clusters about ceremony and timeline, and Sarah found herself standing in the hallway accepting condolences and congratulations that felt surreal after weeks of feeling hunted. Beth hugged her. Frank shook her hand with the kind of firm grip that said respect earned, and Sheriff Hendricks nodded approval that meant more than words because it came from someone who'd spent 40 years trying to keep order in a town that had prioritized secrets over safety. The arrest happened at David's hotel 3 hours after the hearing, Sheriff Hendricks executing warrant that Sarah hadn't known existed, and the charges were specific and damning. Obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, attempted bribery of public officials. The building inspector had confessed, pressure too much, immunity deal offered in exchange for testimony that David paid $10,000 to expedite West Wing condemnation specifically to prevent gold removal before David could claim it through foreclosure. The county clerk's testimony added depth. $5,000 to misfile Eleanor Morgan's adoption papers for Catherine. Deliberate attempt to break Sarah's inheritance chain by erasing the legal connection that made her legitimate heir. The documents had never been lost, clerk explained, just hidden in storage marked for destruction, and recovering them had been simple once someone knew to look. The witness intimidation charge came from phone records, David's number calling Betty Walters repeatedly in the days after Sarah's public testimony went viral. Messages that the 92-year-old had saved because threats from powerful people required documentation even when you were too old to be scared. The recordings were damning, David's voice unmistakable, as he warned Betty that testifying would destroy her reputation, that accusing his grandfather meant accusing the entire town, that elderly women had been known to fall and break hips in facilities with insufficient staffing. Bail was set at $100,000. David posted it within an hour, but the damage was complete. Summit Ridge Development's board voted him out as CEO in an emergency meeting, corporate distancing that happened fast when criminality became public. His wife filed separation papers the next morning, taking Melissa to her mother's house in Raleigh, and the photographs of David leaving his hotel looking destroyed circulated with the kind of speed that suggested Fairbrook residents had been waiting for this fall and wanted evidence it was real. The funeral happened 6 days later, small cemetery on Fairbrook's eastern edge, headstone that Sarah had commissioned reading Anna Marie Raines, 1943-1961. Beloved daughter, sister, mother, finally home in letters carved deep enough to last centuries. The casket was white, covered in marigolds that the florist in Asheville had somehow procured despite wrong season, and 200 people attended, far more than Sarah expected for someone who'd been dead longer than most attendees had been alive. Dr. Whitaker led the ceremony with Cherokee blessing in traditional language, words Sarah couldn't understand but felt in the vibration of vowels that seemed designed for outdoor acoustics, for mountains that absorbed sound and returned it changed. The prayer honored Anna's role as painkeeper, acknowledged her murder as violation of sacred duty, and requested the land's forgiveness for those who'd failed to protect someone meant to heal rather than be broken. Sarah read Catherine's confession letter aloud, every word a public admission of generational cowardice, and her voice cracked on the parts where Catherine described holding Anna while the sedative took effect, whispering apologies that couldn't undo compliance, watching her sister die because speaking up felt harder than staying silent. The confession wasn't justification, Sarah told the assembled mourners. It was evidence that silence compounds harm, that protecting reputation costs more than revealing shame, that Catherine had spent 49 years dreaming of her sister because guilt was interest on a debt that couldn't be paid. Betty Walters spoke from her wheelchair, voice carrying despite frailty, placing white lily on the casket while admitting failure that cost Anna's life and Betty's peace. The apology was simple and complete, 63 years of regret compressed into 3 sentences, and the hope that Anna would forgive her in whatever came after felt less like expectation and more like final request from someone who knew death was close and wanted to arrive with conscience partially cleared. William's eulogy came from Reverend Hayes, read by a younger minister because Hayes was too weak to attend, but had written words that honored William's 50-year vigil as the only kind of devotion that made sense when you'd failed to protect what you loved most. The sweet Severum key was placed on the casket, physical evidence that home wasn't a building, but the reef still to abandon someone, even after death, made that presence symbolic rather than literal. Sophie's contribution surprised at everyone. Small girl walking to the casket alone, with drawing clutched carefully, image of Anna holding baby surrounded by marigolds, and her placement of it on the white wood was reverent in the way children sometimes understood ceremony better than adults. The whispered words carried just far enough for the front row to hear, message delivered with 6-year-old certainty, and Sophie walked back to Sarah's side like this was normal, like receiving thanks from dead women was just part of life when you paid attention to things others chose not to see. The burial itself was conducted with Cherokee ceremony, Dr. Whitaker explaining that returning Anna to earth required acknowledgement that she'd been painkeeper without willing consent, that her death had broken covenant, that proper rest required the land accepting her back not as prisoner, but as honored daughter. The dirt was thrown by representatives of the 47 families from the burial ledger, each handful representing a soul that Anna had tried to help heal before the system designed to support her had killed her instead. And the mound was covered in marigolds that would die with first frost, but were perfect now, yellow bright enough to hurt against brown earth. The reception was held at Cole's Diner, Marcus providing food without charge because some occasions required generosity beyond accounting. And the stories emerged slowly, people who'd known Anna or whose parents had mentioned her, fragments of memory that assembled into portrait of someone kind and strange and doomed by the combination. She'd talked to trees, one old woman remembered, claimed they shared information about sick animals and coming storms. She'd known when guests were lying about their pain, another man offered, could look at someone and describe exactly what hurt even when they'd never met before. The consensus formed gradually. Anna hadn't been cursed, she'd been gifted, and the curse was what the town had done to that gift, how they'd feared instead of honored, buried instead of celebrated. And the 63 years of silence had been town-wide complicity in making sure extraordinary became invisible rather than acknowledged. The announcement about the Marigold Hill Center for Truth and Reconciliation came at the town meeting 2 days after Anna's funeral, Sarah standing at the podium with blueprints and budgets and the kind of determination that suggested this was happening regardless of opposition. The renovation would cost $800,000. Structural repairs to make the building safe combined with updates that preserved historical character while meeting modern accessibility requirements. The East Wing would become museum documenting hotel history, Cherokee's sacred ground significance, and Anna's story told through photographs, ledger entries, and testimony from those willing to speak about what silence had cost. The main building would house Healing Retreat, continuing William's original mission, free or a sliding scale grief counseling for those who needed witnessing more than they needed bills, professional therapists trained in trauma, combined with Cherokee advisors who understood pain-keeping as practice rather than pathology. The West Wing would be rebuilt as Cherokee Cultural Education Center, partnership with Cherokee Nation that provided space for language classes, traditional craft workshops, and ongoing documentation of sacred sites throughout the region, requiring protection and acknowledgement. The funding came from multiple sources, Sarah explained. Her share of the gold providing $700,000 in seed money, Cherokee Nation contributing $200,000, and State Historical Grant providing $150,000 after Dr. Whitaker's successful application, arguing that Marigold Hill represented unprecedented documentation of indigenous European interaction that academic study required preserving. The employment impact mattered to Fairbrook in ways that transcended historical preservation. 12 local jobs created through tour guides, counselors, maintenance staff, and administrative positions that paid living wages in a town where living wages had become mythical. Marcus would serve as co-director, his military background and construction knowledge making him qualified for overseeing both operations and ongoing restoration. And Beth had already agreed to head archives, organizing Laura's research and conducting oral histories with remaining residents who remembered the hotel's operating years. Suite 7 would be preserved exactly as found. Memorial to love that survived death through devotion rather than moving on. And visitors would see the desk where William wrote letters to Catherine, the vase where he placed fresh marigolds for 50 years, the window where he watched mountains and mourned. The guest ledger would be displayed behind glass, names visible but protected. Record of healing and harm existing simultaneously because truth required acknowledging both. The community vote was unanimous. Even those who'd initially opposed Sarah's inheritance claim, swayed by combination of economic benefit and genuine belief that the center might give Fairbrook purpose beyond slowly dying, while pretending viability. The town had been bleeding population since 1973, businesses closing, young people leaving, future shrinking year by year, and maybe this was how reversal began. Not through forgetting what happened, but through remembering it properly, building something from the ruins that honored both the intention and the failure. David Brennan's request for private meeting arrived via his lawyer, and Sarah agreed because Marcus thought she should hear him out, and because refusing felt like maintaining warfare. Neither of them could afford to continue. They met at the hotel, neutral ground that was technically Sarah's property, but felt bigger than ownership. And David looked diminished somehow. Expensive suit replaced with jeans and work shirt, corporate polish sanded away by consequences that kept compounding. His apology came without preamble, acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about everything, that fear of family legacy had made him destroy his own integrity, that watching his wife leave with Melissa had finally clarified that protecting reputation mattered less than being someone his daughter could respect. The CEO position was gone, the development company had fired him, but he'd been offered contractor work through connections who pitied him more than trusted him. And the question he posed was whether Sarah would let him help build the center as penance rather than payment. Sarah's suspicion was earned. 6 weeks of legal warfare creating distrust that couldn't be undone through single conversation, and her challenge was blunt enough to make David flinch. The answer was complicated, David explained, involving dreams of Anna that felt more like visitations. Her expressions wonked rather than angry, and the interpretation he'd reached was that she wanted cycles broken, not perpetuated, wanted Melissa Brennan growing up knowing truth young enough to choose different paths than her ancestors had walked. The work he was offering wasn't forgiveness-seeking, David insisted. It was active restitution, using construction skills to build something good from family history that had produced mostly harm. Marcus's contribution to the conversation was measured, experience with grief making him understand that drowning in guilt versus refining it into purpose was choice people made consciously. And Sarah had 5 years of watching him process Laura's death into something resembling peace that made his assessment carry weight. The condition Sarah imposed was financial rather than symbolic. $50,000 endowment for Anna Raines Memorial Scholarship, funding Cherokee students studying social work or counseling, money that would create ongoing good instead of single gesture. And David's acknowledgement that he didn't have that kind of money anymore required liquidating assets and downsizing life in ways that would take months to accomplish. The timeline would measure commitment, Sarah decided, and her acceptance of his help came with stipulations that this wasn't about David's redemption, but about Anna's legacy, that he was building a memorial to someone his family had destroyed. And if he couldn't handle that moral weight, he should leave now rather than causing more damage through half-commitment. David's agreement was quiet, absent the corporate confidence that had characterized earlier interactions. And Sarah found herself believing him not because she wanted to, but because exhaustion from maintaining anger was its own kind of defeat. And letting him earn his way towards something resembling peace seemed less about forgiveness and more about refusing to let Brennan family dysfunction dictate her choices. The center's grand opening happened 6 months later on a March morning that felt like spring arriving early, temperature warm enough for outdoor ceremony, and sky clear enough to suggest the weather was cooperating deliberately. 800 people attended, mixture of locals, media, Cherokee Nation representatives, and descendants of the 47 whose names now had permanent place in Memorial Wall that occupied the lobby's rebuilt hearth area. The building had transformed through restoration that honored original architecture while removing decay, stone cleaned and repointed, wood replaced where rot demanded but preserved where history could survive. And the result was structure that looked like what it might have been if Eleanor had built with intention to heal rather than profit. The East Wing Museum displayed photographs Sarah had collected, including ones of Anna with William that made visitors uncomfortable because young love was harder to dismiss when you could see it documented. And the curator's notes explained that discomfort was appropriate response to beauty destroyed through prejudice masquerading as propriety. Cherokee Nation representatives performed Blessing Dance in the new West Wing Cultural Center, traditional movements in space designed for their use, acknowledgement that this land had finally been returned to purpose it was meant to serve before European interference. Dr. Whitaker spoke about sacred ground reclamation, academic language trying to contain spiritual concepts that resisted categorization, and her description of the center as model for how places could be healed through truth-telling rather than sanitized forgetting made Sarah's chest tight with something that felt like validation. The speech Sarah delivered was shorter than planned, emotion making words harder than she'd anticipated, but the core message was clear. Anna Raines had died at 18, murdered for the crime of existing in ways that made comfortable people uncomfortable. And 65 years later, her name was finally honored, not because powerful people decided to be merciful, but because witnesses had refused to stay silent. The center existed to say that grief mattered, that truth mattered more than reputation, that healing required acknowledging harm rather than burying it beneath marble floors and polite fiction. The programs launched that day included weekly grief support groups that Marcus would facilitate, his own experience with Laura's death making him qualified in ways that credentials couldn't capture. Cherokee history workshops led by tribal educators brought students from surrounding counties, young people learning about Unega Ikwa and sacred geography and how their own backyards contained stories textbooks had erased. The healing retreats started with 12 participants, mixture of domestic violence survivors, veterans carrying PTSD, and widows whose loss was still fresh enough to hurt with every breath. And the sliding scale payment meant no one was turned away for inability to afford processing pain that needed witnessing. The personal resolutions, 6 months later, felt both complete and insufficient. Progress that couldn't undo damage, but could at least redirect energy towards something resembling purpose. Sarah's role as center director paid $65,000 annually, modest salary that covered expenses and left enough for savings, while the remaining $500,000 from her gold share went into trust funding, her children's education and center endowment that would sustain operations after grants expired. Jake at 15 had become unofficial historian, giving tours that combined academic knowledge with personal investment. His explanations of Anna's story delivered with the kind of passion that suggested he understood this was his story too. Legacy of silence that his generation could choose to reject. The book he was writing had working title, The House That Remembered. Young adult perspective on inherited trauma and the courage required to name it. And the literary agent who'd reached out after reading his blog posts suggested publication was likely if Jake kept writing with the honesty that made readers uncomfortable in productive ways. Emma's art series, Faces of the Lost, hung in the center's main gallery. 47 portraits painted from photographs and descriptions, each person rendered with dignity that their deaths had denied. And visitors spent long minutes studying Anna's portrait specifically because Emma had captured something that photographs missed. Combination of strength and vulnerability that explained why William had loved her enough to spend 50 years mourning. Liam and Sophie had adjusted with resilience that children seemed to possess naturally when adults didn't burden them with adult anxieties. And Sophie's dreams of Anna had stopped after the funeral. Final goodbye delivered with the simplicity of someone who'd completed a task and could now move on to normal childhood concerns like playground politics and whether her rabbit needed a friend. Marcus's relationship with Sarah had developed slowly, friendship deepening into something neither rushed to label because they'd both learned that forcing timelines on emotional recovery created damage rather than preventing it. They had dinner together most evenings, the kids treating Marcus like family in ways that didn't require biological connection. And the conversation about whether this was moving toward marriage could wait because they had time now, future that felt possible rather than terrifying. David Brennan's presence at the center remained complicated. Contractor work on West Wing rebuild that he'd performed with dedication that suggested genuine commitment rather than performance. But the scholarship fund he'd established through asset liquidation had reached 42,000 of the required 50, slow progress that would take another 8 months to complete. His relationship with Melissa was rebuilding through weekly therapy sessions and brutal honesty about family history, and the 8-year-old's question about whether she could visit the center and see Anna's memorial had made David cry in ways that suggested healing was painful before it was peaceful. The final scene arrived 1 year after Sarah's first night at the hotel, September morning that carried hint of fallen air cool enough to need jacket, but not cold enough to regret summer's departure. Sarah stood in Suite 7 alone, early enough that visitors hadn't arrived and staff were still preparing for the day. And she held envelopes she'd found beneath the desk blotter while cleaning, paper that had been there all along but hidden until she'd looked at exact right angle. The letter was addressed to Sarah Mitchell in William's handwriting, dated day before his death, and the discovery felt less like coincidence and more like the hotel releasing information when its recipient was finally ready to receive it. The words were measured, crafted by someone who knew time was short and wanted precision over sentiment. The acknowledgement that they'd never met was followed by connection forged through Catherine's descriptions. Photograph from Sarah's childhood showing her helping carry groceries at 7 years old, already strong in ways that suggested future capacity for bearing weight others couldn't. William's apology for not being brave enough to tell Anna's story himself landed heavy, fear characterized as coward's master, that ruled through threats of consequences that seemed worse than silence until silence itself became unbearable. The explanation of Hotel's purpose clarified what Sarah had suspected. Eleanor's intention had been profit from pain, monetizing healing in ways that corrupted the sacred practice she'd appropriated. But William had tried to transform it, tried to honor what Anna had been born to do even though his efforts came too late and cost too much. The failure was his burden, William wrote, but the success was Sarah's achievement. Courage to finish what 3 generations had been too weak or scared or complicit to attempt. The final paragraph made Sarah's vision blur, words that felt like blessing and burden simultaneously, and she read them twice before understanding fully what William was saying about Anna's presence in the building, in the land, in the stories that visitors would hear and carry away changed by witnessing. The truth about Anna not being in the ground anymore because she existed in every person who walked through the center's doors and chose courage over comfort. In Emma's art that rendered invisible people visible, in Sophie's dreams that had connected past to present, in Sarah's own decision to publish testimony, knowing it would cost her peace, impossibly her inheritance, but was worth both prices because some debts could only be paid in truth. William's gratitude was simple and absolute. Thanks for giving Anna a voice and himself peace. And Sarah placed the letter in the display case that held other William documents. Public record now, because privacy had been the problem. Secrecy had been the weapon used to bury harm, and transparency was the only antidote to poison that had been fermenting for 8 decades. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, recognized the expression on her face as the kind that came from processing revelation that changed understanding retroactively, and his question about whether she was okay received answer that was honest rather than reassuring. The walk through center grounds had become ritual, checking in on spaces that represented different kinds of healing, and Sarah stopped at the marigold garden Sophie had planted where Anna's body had been found, 200 flowers blooming in defiance of approaching frost. The kids were visible through windows, Jake explaining architectural details to tour group, Emma touching up portrait that didn't need touching but provided comfort through familiar motion, Liam and Sophie playing near the chapel ruins that had been partially restored as meditation space. The question about regrets felt rhetorical because Marcus knew her well enough to predict her answer, but he asked anyway because sometimes voicing truths out loud made them more real than keeping them internal. The alternative Sarah described was tempting only in retrospect: wealth without work, comfort without conscience, and the rejection of that path was firm because she'd learned that the hardest thing and the right thing were usually the same thing. Michael's wisdom that had survived him and guided her through decisions that kept choosing difficulty over ease because ease felt like cowardice dressed in self-care language. The visitor approaching interrupted their conversation. Woman in her 40s whose grandmother, Martha Keene, had been entry number 12 in the burial ledger, and her recognition of Sarah was immediate. Gratitude that needed expression, finding words that were simple and complete. The knowledge about what had happened to Martha had been missing for 66 years. Family mythology saying she'd run away but never quite believing it, and seeing her name on the memorial wall made her real again in ways that mattered beyond chronology. The hug was unexpected but welcome. Human contact that said your work matters, your choice to speak up mattered. And Sarah's response was instinctual, understanding that this was always why, making invisible people visible mattered more than any dollar amount or comfort or easy life could offer. Marcus's observation after the woman left was quiet, statement of fact rather than question, and Sarah turned to see him watching her with expression that suggested he saw exactly who she'd become through the fire of choosing truth repeatedly, even when lies would have been easier. The final image was Sarah's response, looking at the center full of people, at the mountain that had finally stopped pressing against the building like it was trying to reclaim it, at her children who'd watched her choose hard truth over comfortable fiction and learned that integrity was worth the price you paid for it. The words came out soft, personal philosophy crystallized through experience. And Marcus's smile said he understood, said he agreed, said they were building something together that would outlast both of them. Sophie's voice carried across the lawn, calling for her mother to see something. And when Sarah approached, her daughter pointed at single marigold petal drifting past window despite no wind. Natural phenomenon that violated physics but honored something older. The pronouncement about stories not haunting but freeing came out with 8-year-old wisdom that suggested she'd been listening to adults talk and formed her own conclusions. And Sarah gathered her close, kissed the top of her head, and believed with the kind of faith that didn't require proof because evidence was everywhere if you learned to see it. The center opened its doors for the day, visitors entering spaces that held truth instead of secrets, and Sarah stood in the lobby watching people encounter Anna's story for the first time, seeing their faces change as they understood what silence had cost and what courage had gained. And she knew with certainty that the inheritance she'd accepted wasn't money or property, but responsibility for making sure pain got witnessed instead of buried, for finishing what Catherine and William couldn't, for building legacy that honored Anna by refusing to let her death be meaningless.